kind of crisis are we really seeing our national capitals really making the efforts as they promised to?
Well, what we are seeing at the moment is a real humanitarian tragedy. The figures that you mentioned in your report of 700 resulting from 3 different shipwrecks have just been reviewed as we have more information after interviewing the survivors. And unfortunately, the death toll has gone up from those 3 incidents. And now the figure that we are using for last week is 880 people dead or missing. This is dreadful. Something needs to be done to address this issue. Year after year, we see thousands of people dying needlessly in the Mediterranean, and we just wonder how long this is going to go on until something is done to resolve this issue.
That's exactly, Mr. Spindler, my question to you, the second part of my question earlier, which is, do you think from the UN's perspective, national governments and national capitals have been doing enough, for example, those of the European Union and even from the United States?
The problem is that what governments are trying to do is to simply prevent people from crossing the sea. This is not going to solve the issue. You really need to address the root causes why people are moving in this way. The reason why people are willing to take these huge risks is because they have no choice. What we need to do is to establish safe legal alternatives so that the most vulnerable refugees can travel legally, safely, without risking their lives in this way. That's one thing that needs to be done. We also need to address the issue of the countries that are hosting the vast majority of refugees. People in Europe have the impression that most refugees are trying to come here. That's not the case. 80 to 90% of all refugees in the world are in the developing world. These are the countries that are hosting the vast majority of refugees, and these countries need help so that they can continue receiving refugees, continue keeping them, offering them decent living conditions so that they don't need to move on these long, dangerous journeys.
Mr. Begg, as Mr. Spindler just mentioned, are European countries, particularly many of those advanced European industrial countries such as the UK, being very selfish that compared to the efforts of even other developing countries in accepting refugees? I understand this could be even one of those reasons for the UK to debate about its Brexit.
Well, certainly European countries are not doing enough to deal with the magnitude of the problem. Mr. Spindler's right. The numbers in Turkey, Lebanon, or Jordan exceed those coming into Europe. So there's clearly an imbalance between what even the countries close to Europe are doing relative to what Europe is able to do. The trouble is that Europe is not a single entity. There is not a European power able to say collectively, we will do this or we will do that, because Europe is 28 individual countries, each of which has its own policies and its own domestic constraints on what can be done. Now, you mentioned the example of the UK. In the UK, the debate has been too many migrants overall coming into the UK, of which a high proportion are European Union nationals moving for work rather than because they're refugees. But the whole thing gets tied together in the same political debate, and unfortunately it's the refugees trying to cross from conflict zones who are the victims of this rather than the internal European migrants.
Of course, as we understand, Dr. Dimitriadi, inside the European continent, there has been so much debate about what role every country should play. Very much the role of Greece is being debated. You are at the front line in terms of the migrants' first choice of residence before seeking another destination. But there has been a lot of agreements, Dr. Dimitriadi, for example, between the European Union and also Turkey. Have those really helped with the current situation, or you think it is only rather a paper, not necessarily going to solve much of the problems just a few weeks after the two sides agreed upon?
Well, The EU-Turkey deal is particularly problematic because it showcases first the inability of the EU member states to come together and create a collective, effective response. The fact that they wanted to outsource the burden to Turkey to begin with is problematic. Turkey is already hosting more than 3 million Syrians. At the end of the day, the question that they're asking, and it's a legitimate question, is why should we handle the burden of this alone? As regards the EU-Turkey deal and its implementation, however, specifically for Greece, we're already seeing that it's not working. The initial applications of Syrians that were processed by the European Asylum Support Office, that's an agency of the Commission regarding asylum here in Europe, deemed the applications inadmissible and authorized their return to Turkey. But on appeals, the Greek committees deemed the applications admissible, saying that Turkey is not a safe third country. And for me, this also reveals a bigger issue. The Europeans increasingly have started talking about safe third countries and safer zones, and it seems that we are recalibrating our approach to asylum. And again, the EU-Turkey deal is a very clear evidence of that, which is problematic because increasingly people who are seeking protection are finding not only obstacles on their way here, but once they get to Europe, once they get to Greece, they're finding even more obstacles in accessing asylum.
Mr. Spindler, I have to come back to you because it seems that every side had things to complain about why they haven't done what others would expect them to do because of certain circumstances, and those are all understandable. And yet, of course, there's a huge, massive migration crisis that's happening, evolving every day. 700 is only a small number compared to the overall number we're likely to get during this summer. So what really can the international community do? I mean, the UN system was being established to handle issues regarding differences among countries. Can the UN be capable? Is the UN still capable?
History shows that when countries get
I'm
together,
not sure
they
if the
can
UN
deal
is
with
Spindler.
very
Mr.
complex
Spindler.
issues.
Yes, go ahead.
What history shows is that when countries get together, they can deal with very complex issues. Let's not kid ourselves. These are very complex issues. There is not a quick fix. But if you look at other efforts, without going far, if you just look at European history since the Second World War, after the events in Hungary in 1956, some 200,000 Hungarians fled to Austria mainly and other countries in Europe. Within weeks, these 200,000 people were relocated, resettled to all over the world. Without going that far, more recently, during the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, we saw also hundreds of thousands of people who fled as refugees to other European countries. During the Kosovo War, we also had an evacuation, a humanitarian evacuation out of Macedonia. That shows that these things can be done. The international community, when it gets to act together, can move very fast and deal with these issues.
Well,
what is lacking at the moment is the political will.
Why there's a lack of political will? Dr. Dimitriadi, I saw your facial expressions while Mr. Spindler seemed to try to give more boost for countries to settle all of the refugees now as a result of the Syrian crisis. Obviously, the two examples Mr. Spindler raised are European countries and the European regions in which it seems that the issues have been handled so far. And yet I also understand there were negative so-called legacies, as some in Europe would also see those settlement of migrants over the past two cases being mentioned by Mr. Spindler. So let me ask you, Dr. Dimitriadi, without further ado, what do you think of the nature of this crisis compared to the two previous cases given by Mr. Spindler? Is this one extremely challenging? Can European countries handle things that are not necessarily 100% related to directly to what they are and who they are?
I don't disagree that in the past we have managed to get together as a global community and respond to crises of this type. I absolutely agree that in the past this has worked. but we have very specific characteristics now in place. It is very clear that the EU leaders are unable to sit down on the table and agree on a joint solution that includes burden sharing and redistribution. All the proposals that were voted essentially have not been implemented. And it's also clear for me that on a global level, we're seeing a failure in response. The UN has repeatedly made calls. The various UN agencies have repeatedly asked for money. It has taken a very long time for states to go back to their base and donate the money that were needed. Some still have not done so. It is very clear that there is stalling, and my impression at least is that there is a hope that eventually this crisis will sort of solve itself out and they won't have to overcommit to it. So although I don't disagree with the spirit and the sentiment, I think that right now, today, in the environment we're in, it's an impractical one. And it's not an issue of the migrants or the refugees. The current situation has revealed a very deep political crisis, as far as I'm concerned, especially in Europe.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Begg, we all understand there's deep political crisis within the EU itself. First of all, as a result of the economic challenges, and secondly, as a result of the rise of the so-called right wing, partly due to economy, partly due to migrant crisis, as some argue. It is really an issue of priorities. Can European countries find these priorities? Meanwhile, Mr. Begg, what can others do in order to make a difference? For example, your allies, Washington, given its promise of more than 10,000 refugees to be accepted, and for so far only a little bit more than 2,000. How much do you think countries can be working together? It's a long question, Mr. Begg, but I hope it can provide some background there for you.
Well, I think the answer is that the international community has to work through agencies like the United Nations to go back to what was being said earlier, solving the root causes of these problems. The Syrian civil war has now been going on for five or more years. Why is it not being solved? It's because there is a tension between the United States and Russia. Ask yourselves whether China is doing enough in the Security Council to try to remedy this. China could put pressure on both sides. I don't see it doing so. Until there is that international commitment to resolve a root cause like the problems in Syria or in other parts of the world like Eritrea, where there have been similar sources of refugees, you're not going to stem the flow of refugees. But there's a very distinct problem in other parts of the world. Many of those coming from Africa towards Europe are not really refugees in the traditional sense. Far more are economic migrants who are seeking to improve their lives. Now, Europe is a country which, a continent which in some cases needs more workers. That's the case of Germany. In other European countries like the UK, we're saying, no, we have enough people coming in. We can't socially tolerate many more. You need to go down to the level of the individual countries in Europe to understand better why a European response is so difficult. But that has to go hand in hand with developments at global level, geopolitical agreements.
Mr. Begg,
they're essential to solving this.
Even though your answer have been very constructive, looking at the root cause of the problem, which is urgently need to be addressed by all countries involved, including the UK, including China, US, and also Russia particularly, and Syria itself. On the other hand, it seems that you are kicking the can down the road, suggesting if the war cannot be stopped, then we'll have to see 700 people die just within a week, just like that, despite the promises made by the European countries with the European Union's decision. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Begg? Briefly from you.
No, it's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when you talk about, the 880 we now learn that were killed last week in these 3 incidents, what that's telling us is that there's a failure in the source country, which has been Libya. Libya is a country which is in total disarray. It's a result of a lack of international action to try to stabilize the country after the fall of Gaddafi. If you don't deal with that, you're never going to stop the criminal gangs, the people smugglers who are behind all the refugees.
All right.
That needs a combination of the humanitarian response, a policing response, and the political solutions I was talking about earlier.
Okay. Mr. Spindler, may I go to you now? As we all are sophisticated enough to understand that the issue cannot be only addressed by looking at one aspect, and yet every aspect, particularly when it comes to the refugee crisis, has to be urgently handled on a daily basis, not just waiting for an eventual solution to a civil war which has already lasted for quite a few years. So what is the imminent, in a way, solutions that countries can work together for, with the hope that they're also working on other front lines in order to solve the real root causes of the problem? Mr. Spindler.
Well, we think that we need to work at different levels. First of all, we need to address, as it has been said before, we need to address the root causes of displacement, whether that is lack of development, lack of governance, human rights violations, or conflict. If you take just the case of conflict, more conflicts have been raging in the last 5 or 6 years in different parts of the world than in many decades before that. We have a number of conflicts that have been going on for years and others that are starting and are not being addressed. The international community seems to be paralyzed and unable to deal with conflict, to find political solutions to them, and to prevent new conflicts from starting. If you just do a quick overview of the situation, you have conflicts in Ukraine, in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Horn of Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in South Sudan, in Nigeria.
And
I mean, the list just goes on and on.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
And as long as we have this many conflicts raging, you will have people fleeing this conflict. So we need to find solutions to this conflict. That's one thing. We also need to help the countries that are receiving the most refugees. In the case of Syrian refugees, that's Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. In the case of refugees from the Horn of Africa, that's Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on. The countries neighboring those that produce refugees are the ones that are receiving the vast majority. We need to stabilize those refugee populations. We need to help them.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of needs, but the question is how, isn't it? Dr. Dimitriadi, before we go, we only have 30 seconds for you, just to be fair. What do you think now? Crisis still goes on. People are complaining. Well, people are saying we don't have solutions alone, and we have to wait for something else ultimate to be done. So what do you think can be done now? Shall we just watch 700 lives lost every week? Dr. Dimitriadi.
Absolutely not. We do have things that we can do right here and right now, especially in the European Union context. We have, in the common European asylum system and in our national frameworks, already established alternatives for legal pathways, both for asylum seekers and for economic migrants. It's just that member states have opted not to use them, and they have opted not to use them because they are obviously, political leaders are always concerned about their base, about re-election, about also in issues of integration, economic costs, and these are all understandable. But I think if we can all agree that bringing in refugees under whatever protection, whether it's the 51 Convention, the subsidiary protection, at the end of the day, they can be beneficial for our societies if we assist them in becoming members of those societies. And we can do this in a legal manner, then we will see a reduction of deaths at sea, and we will also feel more secure because we will know who is coming, when they're coming, and how long they're staying.